We're going to move on to render resolutions. Render resolutions determine the size of your render, and by default that's measured in pixels. The resolutions are determined by the image size section of your render settings window. An image size is near the bottom of the Common tab. For example, right now I'm set to 640 by 480, and that's measured in width and height. That's 640 pixels wide by 480 pixels tall. Now, one way to visualize that, aside from rendering out to the render view, is to turn on a special option inside your view panel. For example, if I'm rendering out the perspective window, I can go up to View in the View Panel menu, go to Camera Settings, and turn on Resolution Gate. Resolution Gate will display a green box which shows me the render area. So I'll turn it on, Resolution Gate, and there it is. The way it works is anything outside the edge of this green box is not rendered. Anything within this green box is rendered. So in fact, if I create a render to the render view window, what I'm seeing corresponds to this green box area. Now, one great thing about this resolution gate is it indicates the shape of your render. For example, a 640 by 480 render has a shape, and that shape is related to aspect ratios. Some aspect ratios are more square and some more rectangular. What is the aspect ratio? Our aspect ratio represents the ratio of the width to the height. And that's important because different display devices require different aspect ratios. And these have been standardized over the years. For example, right now I'm on 640 by 480, and that has an aspect ratio of 1.33. And in fact, down here in the render settings window, there's an attribute that says device aspect ratio. That's the aspect ratio. The 1.33 creates a relatively square aspect ratio. And that's the standard aspect ratio of standard television. Any television that was pre-HD TV, say one that was 5-10 years old that might use a tube or CRT to make it work, that would have a 1.33 aspect ratio and be more square. However, newer formats will have a different aspect ratio. In fact, I can go ahead and change the presets here to one of the other common presets that are used in the industry. And in fact, there's HD. For example, if I switch to HD 720, you'll see that my resolution gate changes to the long rectangular aspect ratio. And that's standard for HD TV television sets or HD TV monitors that you might use on your PC. They're definitely longer than they are tall. And in fact, you'll see in the render settings window, I now have a 1280 pixel width, a 720 pixel height, but my aspect ratio is 1.77. That means that the width is 1.77 times greater than the height. And that's true for the 133 also. If I go back to 640 by 480, if I'm on 640 by 480, that means that the width is 1.33 times greater than the height. In other words, if you were to measure the height, even just using a ruler, and compare that to the width is 1.33 times greater than the height. I'll go back to HD again. HD is much longer and skinnier, so the aspect ratio is 1.77. 1.77 times greater in terms of the width compared to the height. So that's a common industry standard way of measuring the shape of your display device. So the presets carries common render resolutions with common aspect ratios you might use in the industry. It does not include all of them, but includes common ones you might use. Now, once you animate professionally, you have to be aware of this. And if you work on a particular project, there'll be a particular render resolution that's required that has a very specific aspect ratio. So it's better to use something that's standard as opposed to making up your own render resolution. I mean, I could enter my own values here and render out some unusual size, like 100 by 100 pixels, and get a perfectly square render. However, nothing really corresponds to that. You don't have perfectly square TVs, for example. That's an option, but it's better to stick with something that's more common. These days, HDTV has become standard for television, so you're probably going to wind up rendering HD 720 or HD 1080. Both those have the same aspect ratio, the one's just bigger than the other. For example, HD 1080 has a width of 1920 and a height of 1080, but that still has a 1.77 aspect ratio. So it's good to be aware of aspect ratios. It's also good to use a resolution gate for your camera, because that's really going to help you determine what your composition is going to look like. You can imagine that if you are creating something for HDTV, you want to be aware of your long, narrow composition, and that will affect where you place things in the scene, and how you might animate objects moving to make sure you keep them within the view of the camera. Now, everything so far has been measured in pixels. That's standard for animation, standard for visual effects, standard for any kind of 3D animation that will be used for such a project. However, you do have the option to switch to other size units. But all the other size units relate to graphic design work. For example, if I was to switch over to inches, it might be suitable if you're rendering out one frame for something that might be printed in a magazine. And once you do that, then you have the option to choose pixels per inch. However, anything that goes to video, anything that goes to motion picture film, or anything that might go straight out to a game cartridge doesn't really need that. For those types of animation, pixels is perfectly fine. That's where you stay. If it just stays digital and is never printed out, you just measure things by pixels. In that case, you don't have to worry about your pixels per inch. Now, below device aspect ratio, there's also pixel aspect ratio. Now, occasionally this comes into play because a few display devices require a non-square pixel. And that sounds strange, but something like digital video might require a non-square pixel. Why would you want that? Well, some display devices and some recording formats, like digital video tape, like mini DV tape, use non-square pixels to store the information. But what happens is the television is able to stretch the pixels out and make it look correct again. So that becomes an issue with video. Now, you do have the option to render out a non-square pixel here, but the reality is it's better in Maya to always render out a square pixel, and a square pixel simply says 1 right here. So if you keep this set to 1 in terms of pixel aspect ratio, you have a square pixel. Now, if you want to, say, put your animation onto mini DV tape, you can convert that to a non-square pixel, but it's better to do that through the editing program. In general, it's just better to render out square pixels, and then if you need to deal with that through the transfer, you can deal with that through the transfer later on. But that option is there because there are special formats that require a non-square pixel. But if you're just doing animation in general, let's leave that set to 1. So short of it is, you need to check your render resolution to make sure you're rendering at a size that works for you. Also, you want to make sure you're rendering out a size that's a standard format. And also, it might be a good idea to use your resolution gate to determine what your composition is and whether objects are inside the render area or not.